Thank you all for coming. It's really lovely to see such a big crowd here for tonight's event. My name is Paul Roth. I'm the director at the Image Center, which is located on the ground floor of this building. We are in the School of Image Arts building on the campus of TMU. And thank you for joining us tonight for our lecture and conversation with artist Michael Benson. This event is being held in conjunction with the exhibition Michael Benson Planetfall, which opened yesterday here at the Image Center. This show will be on view through April 5th. Tonight, Michael is joining us to talk about his polymathic career, his long engagement with planetary imagery, and his newest body of photographic work, which I'll just say tantalizingly, I hope that it's the exact opposite of his planetary imagery. Following his lecture, Michael and I are very pleased to be joined by Anne Thomas, who is the legendary senior photography curator at the National Gallery of Canada. Before we begin, I do want to mention that this event is happening on the campus of Toronto Metropolitan University. We are located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples, and we embrace our responsibility for stewardship of this land where our institution is located. And before I begin, I would like to note a couple of things about tonight's program, a little bit of housekeeping in advance. First, we are recording tonight's conversation, and that's because we're planning to upload it to YouTube, to our channel on YouTube as soon as we can, so that it can be seen by people who aren't able to attend in person tonight, people who might want to discover it later, and any of you who want to see it again. And second, importantly, after the lecture, we're going to have a conversation with Anne Thomas, and after that, we will be taking questions from the audience. So if over the course of the evening you think of something that you want to ask, please hold it until that moment, and then when you're ready to ask your question, of course, raise your hand, and then we will bring you a microphone. The reason for that is that we want to be able to get your question very clearly on the recording that we are making for YouTube. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Benson. Michael's work focuses on the intersection of art and science. His practice has spanned a range of media through the years, from large format photographic images to nonfiction books and essays, to the creation of illustrated books, and also films. Over the last decade, Michael has staged a series of increasingly ambitious exhibitions of digitally constructed cosmic landscapes in museums and art galleries worldwide. He has written for many publications over the years, including The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, New York Review of Books, and many others. And very recently, he was a visiting scholar at the MIT Media Lab and a fellow at the New York Institute of the Humanities. Among Michael's many books, I want to highlight the one that is currently in print, and his most recent book, Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and the Making of a Masterpiece, which is an extraordinary and revelatory account of the making of Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. If any of you are fans of that film, this is the definitive recounting of how it was made. And I really love this book, and that's why I'm highlighting it. Recently, Michael has been using a scanning electron microscope to focus on natural design at sub-millimeter scales for his newest project, which he will tell you more about tonight, and it is called Nanocosmos. We're so happy to welcome Michael Benson to the stage tonight. Thank you very much for being here, Michael. Over to you.
Okay, I'm going to lower the lights. It worked. Great. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for coming out on a frigid night. I flew in from Ljubljana, Slovenia on Sunday, and I was not really prepared for the impact. So because I have the privilege of mixing it up with Anne and Paul after, I'm going to have a fairly compressed, almost quasi-journalistic account of my career, such as it is. And then maybe we can get into some of the more, sort of conceptual underpinnings, let's say, of what I've been about in the discussion. I do want to say that as an artist and a writer and as a human being, I've always been fascinated by frontiers as defined by, the definition of frontier being the border between what we know or think we know and what remains mysterious. And I like going there. I simply love going there. And I found things to do there, basically, and typically involved with retrieving images from that space. But I don't do that as a scientist, but I do like using the technologies that allow me to go to those places, which typically are associated with scientific research. And I'm looking for other types of discoveries than scientific discoveries. They're sort of related, but they're not the same. I'm also fascinated by the ways in which images are non-verbal carriers of knowledge. They freight knowledge. They freight understanding, and I'm also interested in the history of our efforts to represent various aspects of the universe. And finally, the role of such representations as we construct our sense of our position in space and time, if I can put it that way. And I used this quote as an epigraph of a book I released 10 years ago called Cosmographics, with the title being a riff on Italo Calvino's book Cosmic Comics, which I highly recommend everybody who hasn't read it to get a hold of that thing. Okay. In the universe now, there was no longer a container and a thing contained, but only a general thickness of signs superimposed and coagulated, occupying the whole volume of space. It was constantly being dotted minutely, a network of lines and scratches and reliefs and engravings. The universe was scrawled over on all sides along all of its dimensions. There was no longer any way to establish a point of reference. The galaxy went on turning, but I could no longer count the revolutions. Any point could be the point of departure. Any sign heaped up with the others could be mine. But discovering it would have served no purpose because it was clear that independent of signs, space didn't exist and perhaps had never existed. Now, I would submit that Calvino's observations really do capture the absurdity of, but also the absolute necessity of the ways that we as humans attempt to comprehend a subject as immense as the universe, not to mention our position within it and our existence within it. Those ways are utterly necessary for all of the reasons that Calvino implies, because independent of signs, space may as well not exist in the first place, just as without language, we would have far less of an ability to attempt to structure phenomenal reality in our minds. And I would submit that this cover, designed by my Slovenian collaborator Boris Balant, who I'm working with on my next book actually, presents this dilemma and position pretty well. At first glance, it would seem an evocation of a geocentric cosmos, and it is that. But as the eye at the center indicates, it's also a presentation of how we have looked at the universe for many centuries. I mean, we're always at the center of our sensorium, aren't we? The most subjective can be the most objective, as Tarkovsky said, the great Russian filmmaker. And that brings me to another great European observer of nature, this one with a somewhat more ambiguous past than Italo Calvino, who joined the partisans and fought the fascists. Werner Heisenberg was, of course, a theoretical physicist and one of the great pioneers of quantum mechanics. But he was also the lead scientist in the Nazi nuclear weapons program. However, he didn't achieve, thankfully, the construction of such a weapon. Anyway, this quotation is something I think about often. Nature exposed to our methods. Okay, now I'm going to get to the biographical part, the boring part. My path to this kind of image making, which you can see in the show downstairs, was pretty circuitous. I studied photography. I was an English major as an undergraduate, but I also studied photography, and I've been a photographer since I was a kid, really. And then after I graduated, I went to work at the New York Times, in a news assistant capacity. And then I left pretty soon, within a year or so, to work as a freelance journalist, but I also took photos to illustrate my own pieces. And this shot of Russian rock star Boris Grebenshchikov was taken in the mid-'80s, and I used it in a feature I wrote for Rolling Stone magazine about Russian rock and roll under the glasnost, under Gorbachev. But this was its most prominent placement back in 1989, when the Village Voice was about 150 densely printed pages and actually meant something culturally, if I could say so. That means in the pre-internet era when print mattered. By the way, Boris Grebenshchikov is currently in London. He had to leave Russia because he objected to the invasion of Ukraine. So after some time of doing that kind of thing, I grew dissatisfied. I had always had a gnawing ambition to be a filmmaker, but I had trepidation as well. But in any case, in 1990, I took the plunge. I went to film school, NYU Graduate Film School. And at the end of that, I moved to Slovenia, then Yugoslavia, to make a film about a multimedia art movement called NSK. And Predictions of Fire is the name of the film. I used the film to examine a series of issues, including the relationship between art, ideology, and mass media, and specifically the way those things led to ethnic conflict and war. And I also looked at the history of Slovenia and so on. I conceived of the film before the actual war broke out, but then I made it while it was still raging, while Sarajevo was under siege. Slovenia had gotten away with just a 10-day war, a short 10-day war, and I made it there. It's a feature-length documentary. I premiered it at Sundance in Berlin, the Sundance and Berlin Film Festivals in 1996. And incidentally, it won a National Film Board of Canada Best Documentary Award at Vancouver International Film Festival. So I have a very warm feeling about the National Film Board of Canada. But anyway, so that's Ljubljana, where I live now. My wife is Slovene. I met her when I made that film. It's a beautiful town. You should come visit and find me, and we'll have a drink. And there were various roadblocks in post-production for a second film I was working on that I won't get into here because they still aggravate me. This is in the late 90s. And meanwhile, the internet magically arrived. You know, for an expat, lifelong expat like myself, the internet was particularly an amazing thing. And before too long, I found myself using up a dial-up modem to go to pages like this. This is a typical set of thumbnails from an interplanetary mission, one of the two Voyager spacecraft that first explored the outer solar system. As presented at NASA's PDS node, Planetary Data Systems node. And you know, again, I'm drawn to the frontier, and the arrival of the internet suddenly allowed me to break through the barrier of print journalism and photo editors and all of that to go straight to the mother lode where all those images are. And I found that just fascinating, and I started to get involved in, before I get to that, I should mention that starting in the early 60s, the human race, mostly NASA, later the European Space Agency, and the Russians from the beginning, started sending waves of camera-bearing spacecraft throughout the solar system to investigate the system of turning worlds, like picture an Alexander Calder mobile turning all the time with the sun at the center, and Earth is just one of those elements of it. And you know, so I was just fascinated by this whole story, and I started to indulge myself by tracing what I've called the image trajectories of some of these missions, because all those images are there, you know. And effectively, you know, anybody who wants to can become a little bit of a ghost in the machinery meaning you can look through the eyes of the machines we've sent out there. And I started to do that. Very nerdy and strange thing to do, obviously. So my first professional result of these self-directed, very subjective, very non-scientific excursions into the image databases of various interplanetary missions was this detailed and lengthy feature story I wrote for the Atlantic Monthly about the procedure. And it remains actually the single piece of magazine journalism I'm most proud of. And in effect, I was repeating the pattern I had followed in the 80s, which was to write pieces, but also take photos for them. But in this case, I was not taking the photos myself. I was finding raw data in the archive, raw images in the archives, and cleaning them up. So for example, that image of Saturn there, I found it surrounded by thousands of images in the archives, and I just thought that is extraordinary. And here's another angle. You see, that's a different shot of Saturn. And that's a single frame from Voyager, one of the Voyager spacecraft. It will never print larger than about this size, but it's such a choice thing, I thought. And as you can probably tell from how I'm talking about it, the image production started to take precedence for me. And during the first phase of this, what amounted to exploration, self-directed explorations within archives of the solar system, I found quite a number of rather extraordinary images, that had never really been highlighted or excavated or promoted or brought to the public, with an eye to making an argument that they belong to the history of graphic representation, the history of photography, the history of the arts, which is what I suddenly saw myself getting involved with. And effectively what's going on is that planetary scientists go into those archives looking for what they need to look for, which is information about, I don't know, the content of the atmosphere of Jupiter or the dynamics of the rings around Saturn. And I was going in with a different agenda, looking for a different type of, let's say, revelation. And just to give a sense of this, so that's the raw frame. That's not even that's not the raw frame as I first got it. That's a little bit contrast enhanced. But, some work had to go into this just to get it to the right place. Okay, so then the second professional result after that Atlantic piece really was my first book for Abrams, probably the leading publisher of illustrated books in the United States. Called Beyond. The first of a series of books for Abrams. It went into print in 5 languages, and I'm happy to say it sold really well. It was, by expensive image-based book standards, it was a bestseller, which is cool. You always want your first book to do well. And incidentally, the great Arthur C. Clarke, who I got to know during that period, wrote the foreword for the book for me. That's me with him back in the year 2001 when I first met him. A year not without a certain, importance in his biography. So, just back to the archives, you could almost say that what we're seeing here is a bottomless set of contact sheets, right? But it's missing the ego and the superego of a photographer, yeah? So I realized, okay, so what's missing is somebody who can jump in and make the coherent case, hopefully coherent case, that 60 plus years of interplanetary exploration belonged, as I said, to this great story of our graphic representation of phenomenal reality. And what was necessary was that ego and superego. So with probably typical egoism, I gave that assignment to myself. To take on the role of photographer within this big science construct. And I would note that all these raw frames are public domain. NASA has an extremely enlightened, taxpayer-funded NASA, releases everything to everybody. North Korean scientists, if they have a dial-up modem today, can access this material. So the previous Saturn image was a single frame. As I got better at my self-appointed task, I started working with mosaicing and tiling together individual frames to achieve higher resolution composite images. So I'll give you a sense of that from very early on. This is from, must have been the year 2002 maybe. I was going through the Voyager archive and I found this shot and I thought, what is that? Aha, okay. That is Europa. It's an ice-covered ocean orbiting Jupiter. It's one of the most tantalizing and enigmatic objects in the solar system, actually, because the liquid water ocean under the ice probably has 2 to 3 times as much water as all the oceans of the Earth, and it very well may be home to life. We don't know. So then I assembled all these frames, got here, that's the shadow of the moon down below, and finally settled on this as the final image, the final composite. And that's the great red spot of Jupiter behind Europa. I could have made this in color, but I liked it so much in black and white, I thought this is it, you know. Okay, so by the late noughts, I had moved into serious printmaking efforts, and I was working hard to produce images that could stand on their own as digital chromogenic prints in gallery settings and museum settings. In 2011, I started showing them, for example, at Hasted Krautler Gallery on West 24th Street in Chelsea, which represented my work for about a decade, and that's from my second show there. I also kept on producing books. I think I'm up to 6 now. No, I'm up to 7 now. Anyway, I'm working on my 8th, I believe it is. And then, you know, I'm just going to wind down already by talking a little bit about what I'm doing now, which is, you know, as Paul mentioned, I actually currently have phantom limb syndrome because for 6 years I had access to this extraordinary scanning electron microscope at the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa. We lived there for 6 years. I'm now back in Ljubljana. And I got quite used to being able to go use this extraordinary instrument almost whenever I wanted, and I was doing this project called Nanocosmos. I don't have that anymore, but that forces me to actually do a book and maybe an exhibition in the end. So the scanning electron microscope uses a vacuum chamber. There's a vacuum chamber at the bottom of the gun, electron gun, and you know, this is the draft cover of the new book, and that is a radiolarian. That's the silica skeleton left behind by a single-celled marine organism called a radiolarian. And there are many closer views of that, which will be in the book as well. And here's another crazy radiolarian. So can you believe that a single cell can produce something like that? You know, it's kind of mind-blowing. Trying to change, So this is the single most ambitious composite mosaic in the whole project so far. That one took about a month to assemble, and it's probably 280 or so individual scans. And what you see there is an Adriatic flowering plant that's no more than a 1/4 centimeter wide, the whole plant, with an aphid in it. And I kind of amuse myself with this one. It's, you know, I compare it to Rousseau's, you know, that tiger in the jungle painting. This creature in this jungle, that's what it is. It's a creature in a jungle. This is a view from the front of paired dragonfly wings. And this, too, was weeks of work because it's so many different scans. I mean, I won't get into the details of the depth of field issues with an electron microscope and how you know, it's very tricky to have good depth of field with this device. You have to do many, many scans to get, and then you do something called focus stacking to stack them so you get a sharp image. But what I love about that is it's a landscape as well as a portrait of it's an aerodynamic landscape, let's say. This is another radiolarian. Actually, Elaine Glass, who, is Elaine here? No. Well, I just printed a large version of that at Elaine Glass's studio the other day, and I realized that's not so bad. It works okay. And then, you know, you get to kind of back to planetary landscapes with some of this subject matter. Another radiolarian, they come in many different, you know, morphologies, which all has to do with their cryptic, mysterious purpose in the ocean, which I cannot begin to explain because I'm not a scientist. And actually, scientists don't even necessarily understand it either. And then there's the sci-fi aspect of it, which, you know, which I love. And that is really it, although I do have this slide, which takes us back to this question of representation. Czech architectural historian and theorist Dalibor Vesely had a lot to say about the changing nature of representation through history, which is something that fascinates me as well, and which I treat in cosmographics. And that's really my compressed, you know, this is compressed because I want to mix it up with my good friends here and have a discussion. So thank you very much.
All right. I'm hoping that Anne can join us as well
okay.
now. Thank you, Michael, that talk.
Thank you.
That was a quick version through what could have been a much more detailed, much longer story about
in fact,
the many things you've done.
I have a longer talk, but I really wanted to have a discussion. Yeah. Was it too short? Okay.
So I want to start by introducing Anne, because we first introduced Michael and concentrated on him, but we have no less an august presence on this panel as well.
More august, much more august.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of you probably do know about Anne, but bear with me. Anne was the senior curator of photographs and interim chief curator at the National Gallery of Canada before her retirement in March 2021. She currently works as an independent curator and as a consulting expert on the history of photography. And she is one of the key figures in the construction of the institutionalization of photography here in Canada. Over her more than 40-year career, she has lectured, been a member of innumerable panels and juries for any number of associations and organizations internationally. And she has organized far too many exhibitions and installations to count. She's authored several catalogs and publications. But I do want to mention a few. Among her most important books are her still definitive study of Lisette Model from 1990. Of great importance to tonight's panel, her book Beauty of Another Order, Photography and Science, published in 1997. No Man's Land, The Photographs of Lynn Cohen from 2001. And more recently, capping her career, The Extended Moment, 50 Years of Collecting Photographs at the National Gallery of Canada in 2018. Anne is currently researching and writing on the work of Canadian artist Spring Hurlbut. So please join me in welcoming Anne Thomas to the Image Center. I want to tell you that since Anne's retirement, I've been trying to think of a good moment to ask Anne to be here. This is, I hope, just the first of many. We're very pleased to have her here, and I know Michael feels the same way.
Oh, absolutely.
So I want to start actually by asking Anne a question that relates to the experience of Michael's work. And I'll start by just telling you briefly how I first encountered Michael's work, because it was an interesting moment for me, and I'll have to make a couple of frank admissions right now. The first is that when you spend a lot of time looking at photography, you can get bored with what you're seeing. And for me, one of the most challenging parts of my job is going to art fairs. There are a lot of people that love art fairs and they discover a lot of great things at art fairs. I am not one of those people. I am a person who goes to them with great trepidation I have to force myself to go into one booth after another to look at work. And it's partly because there's just so much stuff in one room, and it tends to emphasize the certain aspects of the field that are not my favorite thing. In particular, the commercialization and the sale of art. I have no problem with it. I'm very glad that we have many great dealers. I want artists to sell their work, so it's not any kind of opposition like that. It's that I am confronted with the mercantile aspects of the medium, and it tends to put me in a bad mood. And so as I walk around, the thing that irritates me most is seeing similar stuff that looks the same, booth after booth, year after year. It's just exhausting. And anyway, one year I was walking through APAD, which is the big photo dealer fair in New York, and feeling crabby. And I spotted in a booth a gigantic picture of something. I don't remember anymore which planet, but it was my first encounter with Michael's work. And I was really startled because it stood out. It was really different from everything else that I was seeing at the fair. And also, and I think this is very important, it didn't look like the other stuff that was trending that year. So it wasn't just that it was different from what I was seeing. It seemed like an act of defiance on the part of the dealer. And I really liked that. So I walked up and I looked at it, and as I got closer, this is key because if you've seen the show, you know that you start by seeing them from a distance and they're legible at a distance. But when you get in close, they don't stop working. You fall into them. There's so much detail in many of these pictures. And it was one of the earliest experiences that I had had with that outside of the work of our local friend, Ed Bertinsky, who of course is a pioneer of large-scale work. Anyway, I was so floored by this that I sought out the dealer and I spoke to him, I think Joseph Krautler.
Joe Krautler, yeah.
And he told me a little bit about Michael and his work, and I think he might have had one of your books there to show me. And then somehow, within another year or two, I connived to meet you. I don't quite remember how.
Eric
Himmel. That's right. So we have a mutual friend, and in fact, we found out after a while that we had a lot of mutual friends, some very surprising ones. But anyway, one of our mutual friends is his editor at Abrams Books, now retired, a man named Eric Himmel, who also, not incidentally, is the son of the great fashion photographer and graphic designer Lillian Bassman. And Eric is now one of my best friends, and he's long been one of your best friends.
Yeah, and mentor.
Yeah. And Eric, I think that Eric asked me what I saw at the fair. I think I was staying with him. And he asked me what I saw at the fair that I liked. And I said, I saw this one thing that I really liked. And I told him, and he said, well, I publish his books. Do you want to meet him? So that I think is how it happened.
Yes, that is how it happened.
Anyhow, and then over time, we've developed a relationship out of that, which often doesn't have much to do with photography. Sometimes, though, it does. Anyway, the reason why I made that preamble is that I want to ask Anne about how she first encountered the work and how it struck her. And the reason is that among the mutual friends that we found we had was Anne. And I remember, I think that Michael had already moved to Ottawa.
Yes.
And I was talking to Anne, and I think I told her that I was going to be seeing this gentleman who lived in Ottawa. And she said, well, I know Michael. I know Michael's work.
And he's not a gentleman.
And we geeked out for a minute or two about Michael's work, which was quite fun, because I didn't really know how many people knew about him in Canada. So well, how did you encounter it?
I mean, there were only
my
three people who knew about me in Canada. It was like...
My first introduction to Michael was through Marc Maillet, who was the director of the National Gallery, and I think had met you in New York, or at some previous...
I first met him in Ottawa.
In Ottawa?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so knowing my interest in this historic account of photography and art and science, the sort of the way that it was described in the early days of photography was the hyphen between art and science. Francis Way, who was a French critic, explained it as, it's the hyphen between art and science. And then an astronomer, Burr, called it the art science. There were all kinds of ways of trying to reconcile this new visual medium that was bringing together scientific curiosity and examination, investigation, and artistic expression. So he said, oh, you should meet Michael Benson and you should see his work. So that was how I first saw it. But the impact that it had was astounding because I was so used to looking at 19th century representations, photographic representations of photography, and loved them, you know, like just, I loved the curiosity and the determination, the drive to find out about something that was so far away and so absolutely ungraspable, you know, and in some cases invisible to our eye. And so that was, and this was so, you know, I knew the work of David Mallon, Michael Light as well, and respected that. But this did bring in a very strong, the presence of the prints is perhaps also what you were talking about. Almost like portraits, you know, he suddenly sort of felt, oh, this is my kind of, you know, cosmic family. So that was, yeah, my.
I should mention that there was a show up at the Museum of Nature, which in fact was where I was doing that work.
Yeah.
So the prints were there,
yes.
and there was an opportunity to see them, which is otherwise not, you know, so easy necessarily.
Yeah. That was key for me because I had seen his work in little dribs and drabs, and of course through the books. But until the show at Museum of Nature, I had not seen the solar system project put together in a narrative. And the exhibition that we have here is edited from that. I do want to say that it was only after many years of communicating with Michael and looking at his work and thinking about it that I started to understand what it could bring to our audience. Not that I doubted the value of the images, it was more that I wanted to know how it fit into what we do, and what we do is we're always looking at the medium of photography, even while we're looking at the subject of any individual photograph or series of photographs. And at a certain point, I think I finally started to slightly understand what Michael's project was. And I'm still quite a neophyte, right? I'm not knowledgeable about science. Every day that I talk to this man, he says something that he's expecting me to know and understand, and I, like an idiot, have never heard.
Yeah.
Right. And so for me, this has been an interesting education, looking at his work and thinking about what it means to take autonomously created images, images made by others over vast periods of time. Some of his single pictures were made over hours, minutes, maybe sometimes even over longer periods than that, which is incredible to think about because they look like individual split-second crystalline images, but they're constructed from a temporal documentation made over vast distances. Sometimes the spacecraft that, you know, that is carrying the camera is jetting across the sky. You very memorably talk about it, the speed of a rifle's bullet.
Yes, indeed.
Can you imagine taking pictures, a robot taking pictures at the speed of, like, I mean, it's crazy that you can see anything, let alone that you end up with these fantastic images, which you can then work with, make sense of, make real color from. So once we understood that, we actually worked with the existing show that was at the Museum of Nature. I do want to give credit to them and also to Michael, because while I'm called the curator of the show, really this is Michael's narrative encapsulation of the work that he was doing all these years on this project. And the trajectory from the Earth outward to the outer solar system is, I think, a really fascinating way of taking an audience further and further and further away from the ground where we stand with our cameras to these places that we would otherwise never have any intense visualization of. One more point I want to make is that I feel like one of the really interesting things that your pictures do is that they take a subject that is truly extraordinary and remind us that that's an extraordinary subject.
Yes.
Right? Because I think we've all seen many images from the solar system through our lifetimes. I think most of us encounter them as children. We see them in publications. We see them imagined through CGI or earlier practical special effects in movies like 2001 and other science fiction films. But I have to say, when I saw his pictures for the first time, I thought, wow, I've really taken these images for granted, which is a strange realization that you can look at a picture of something incredible and take it for granted. But I think my whole life in photography, I didn't think much of pictures of the planets. And now all of a sudden, I could engage with them in an aura of humility and awe. And I could learn something from them, not just look at them. That was really, really interesting to me. And I know that in many ways that's your program. And so I want to ask you about, and I really want to ask both of you about this statement that you made pretty early in your talk, which you've made before, which is you contest that planetary imagery properly belongs to the arts
Yes.
as much, if not more, than the sciences. And I'd like to hear you explain what you mean by that. And also, Anne, from your background, working with the relationship between art and science and photography, I'd like to hear what you think as well.
Well, okay, if you go back to the Renaissance, the great artists of the Renaissance, you know, a lot of their work, I've been thinking about this a lot recently because I was laboring over the introduction to my new book, Nanocosmos, and referencing high Renaissance works. And then the moment when, or the period when, even if the subject matter was ostensibly religious, the attention to nature within the painting was such that clearly the artist had a slightly different agenda than simply reifying these narratives that had been brought down from the you know, Judeo-Christian tradition and so on. And with you know, okay, so Leonardo, of course, is the classic case, and in fact, I'm going to have a full-frame reproduction of his portrait in the National Gallery in Washington, you know, of, I forget her name now, but, you know, this extraordinary portrait of a young woman.
Ginevra da Benci.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So with that work, you know, all of that research into optical phenomenon, all that proto-photographic research is visible in other works by Leonardo and other high Renaissance, you know, brilliant artists. So in some ways, you know, what's happening now with technology and art coming back together, you know, emphatically for some decades now, really, is that we're returning to this, a place where there's a bit of a fusion, you know, between science and art and between technology and art, yeah. And so, you know, I just see that this, this incredible image quest, or this achievement of opening the solar system to human eyes for the first time after centuries of questions, you know, about what are those wandering lights. I mean, planets is Greek, ancient Greek. The word planet is ancient Greek for wandering star. In our lifetimes, because we are rather venerable gentlemen now, sorry, Paul. In our lifetime, and in our lifetime, you know, the solar system has gone from a huge question mark, really, you know, Mars, what is there, you know, Jupiter and Saturn, to a verifiable, nuanced, granular, you know, places subject to lighting, atmosphere, dust storms, you know, all that stuff. Of course, it's a scientific achievement. And by the way, in all of my images, you know, I always acknowledge this is Voyager 2 on this date. And then the credit line says NASA, JPL, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm at the end of the, you know. It's obviously impossible without big science, you know, to do what I'm doing. It has been kind of a...
Can you just repeat that?
It's impossible without big science,
big science
to do what I'm doing with that work. It is as much an artistic achievement if seen correctly and if the argument is made, which is part of what I'm doing, as it is a scientific one. And it belongs in, and it will belong in the future. It will be seen as belonging to the history of our attempts to visualize phenomenal reality, you know, which can be either scientific or artistic, depending, or both. I guess, I don't know if I answered your question, but I mean, that's what Cosmographics was about, that book, is looking at 4,000 years of attempts to understand the universe through graphic image, the graphic image, pre-photographic image.
Right. Essentially the context before your work, before the things that you've made.
Yeah.
And I'd love you to jump in here because, you know, one of my earliest introductions to the use of photography in science is through your book. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you see as the context for this work that Michael is doing.
Yeah, well, I also think it might be interesting just to let you know how I jumped into that subject. At the time of the Lisette Model exhibition, there was a mineralogist, a friend of Joseph Bloom, who was Lisette Model's executor of her estate and a lawyer who looked after the estate in New York. And Joseph had this friend, Julius, and he was, as I said, a mineralogist, and we got chatting about the relationship between art and science. And I recounted a story about when I was a teenager, I had gone into an art gallery. This was in Johannesburg. I was born in South Africa and left as a 21-year-old. But I was a teenager, and I'd gone into this gallery, and it was filled with abstract painting. And my grandmother was a very conventional, a la Constable kind of painter. And so I was horrified by this. And the owner of the gallery said, so what do you think of these paintings? And I said, oh, it's abstraction. No, I don't like it. He said, come over here. I want to show you some slides and get your opinion on this. And of course, you know, teenager being asked to give their opinion on anything was like really important. And I thought they were amazing. And there was geological, like photomicrographs of geological structures. And it just was magic for me to see something like that and then to turn and look at the painting. So there was that kind of residual curiosity, but also affirmation that these were not two worlds that were so separate, that there was a conversation going on between art and science. And so I think that conversation is still going. It is still what makes me really excited about the kind of work that you're doing. And I hope it never gets compartmentalized totally as one or the other. I think sometimes scientists, I have a few examples where scientists have a very fixed position on what they think art is and what artists want to do or they want to look at. We had a fellow at the National Gallery, and she was very interested in, she's of Egyptian extraction, and did a beautiful intervention in the British Museum of one of the tombs of the pharaohs, and she surrounded it with Gothic, British typical ironwork that surrounds sepulchres and so on. And then she cultivated a date palm from Egypt and put them into test tubes and lit them all around so it was a way of restoring an environment to the pharaoh, who was now in the British Museum in London. Wow. And so, those kinds of, and she had a fellowship at the National Gallery, and then part of her fellowship was to go to a science lab in England and do some plant cultivation in the same vein. And when she got there, they had taken out beakers and all kinds of things. They were very sweet. We have this artist coming to work here. This is what she would like to photograph. And she said to them, no, I'm interested in learning about plant cultivation. And so this is, we still live in a world where there are fixed positions about what art is and what science is. And the joy in seeing work like this is that it's about both,
I've had conversations with Robert Polidori, the architectural photographer, who does a lot more than architectural photography, but he's known for that, who became a friend 10 years ago or so, about what we do versus what they do.
Yeah.
And what they do is, meaning artists who are not like what we do, and I was honored to be included in his in his list of, or his short list, I think, of people who do things like what we do. What they do is express subjective states, and let's say photo-based artists who are not doing what we do. Whereas what we do, he said, is we explore phenomenal reality. And he said that cuts to the oracular is the word, oracular role photography can have, where something speaks through it from phenomenal reality. And I think he's right that we're discovering things with photography. I mean, he does it very differently than me. He's doing, other things. But there is a fascination with phenomenal reality and allowing it to speak through what we're doing, and finding out what it is, which is different from what a lot of artists are interested in doing. But, but it does kind of constitute its own angle.
Yeah. Well, on that, I mean, that raises a really interesting question that I've been wondering about, and I've talked to other people who are looking at your work for the first time, and they've asked me questions which echo one question I have. Very tantalizingly, early in your talk, you showed this battery of images of Jupiter from
Voyager, one of the Voyagers flying past Jupiter, wide field and narrow field, wide field, narrow field.
And it's from, is it a recent view of, of that
late
database?
70s, late 70s.
No, I don't mean the image, I mean the view of the database.
No, not that recent, but I mean, it would look like that today.
Yeah. So anyhow, when you're trolling through those images, a series of decisions are made, right? And they start and they don't stop really until you're done with the finished image, the print, even the framing. Right, so there's a series of images, but the images are not made for that purpose, right? No one ever put those images online thinking that somebody who calls himself an artist is going to come along and make an image, right? And you make some really interesting choices. And I think anybody that sees the show will know what I mean, particularly when you're looking at your mini images of Saturn, when you're looking at the incredible room on Mars. You'll see a lot of very different angles and perspectives, different, sometimes extremely oblique angles. Sometimes the images are confusing. You don't know what's up, down. You don't know if you're looking at true color or not. You can't quite tell what the perspective or the angle is. There's one in particular where you see the rings of Saturn, but you see the knife's edge, and you can't quite relate to the ground. So there's a form of, clearly, many of them, I take for granted, are landscapes. They are operating in an art historical landscape tradition, and they work just to any viewer as landscapes. However, they're pretty weird landscapes, and not because they're strange places necessarily, but because you, going through all of those images, have seized on certain things, and then you have worked and worked and worked to bring those forward, right? So I wanted to ask, how do you do that? How do you make those decisions? Is it capricious and a choice you make individually each time you're going through the images, or do you have a mission that you're trying to satisfy here?
It's very subjective and capricious, I suppose. I mean, it's really, if you go through thousands of images like that, it's just what catches your attention at that moment. I mean, what really catches your attention. So, I mean, I remember going through all these images of Viking orbiter images of, for example, of Mars, and then seeing a dust storm start to build on the planet below. And we're talking about a kind of a filmic logic, because if there's an orbiter going for decades, which is what happened, taking a picture every 15 minutes, then you get film strips. There's a narrative, there's a visual, there's a temporal narrative, time-based image chain, and watching a dust storm build on the planet below, and then finally have texture and lighting on it and a quality that's fascinating, and then to realize that actually it has grown to a planet-wide dust storm, and then, okay, the time has come to see if this can be put into, made into an image, because it will speak. Sometimes there's a feeling, speaking of oracular, photography as an oracular thing. Sometimes what is being said or what is being seen wants to communicate somehow. I mean, I don't want to sound new age or mystical here, but there's just, especially if it's 3 in the morning and you've gone through 10,000 of these images today, and then suddenly a bald man's head pops into the frame with clouds behind it. It's like, what is that? Like, okay, that would seem to be Europa in front of cloudscapes. That's interesting. It's just obvious sometimes, and then
Michael,
sometimes
isn't
less
that
so.
how scientific master?
Well, okay.
Seeing bald-headed men at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, right. So it's really hard to say, but I don't have a program. I am sort of a sucker for foreground object, background object to try to show depth, this extreme depth that can be brought forward or brought into focus by extreme telephoto photography, by which I mean really these spacecraft have telescopes on them. And then the wide field view is a different story. It's more of it's not as long a telescope. So, part of it is going on a little journey, and then, there is an element of being on a journey and taking your own photo, which is not what happens, because I don't take the photos, but a moment occurs where you feel like this has to be preserved, and there it is. The photos have been taken. The raw material has been taken. One thing I didn't get into in the talk, by the way, is for the color images, they also start as black and white images. So that slide that was up of all those black and white images were taken through different filters typically. So the images might be taken through red, green, and blue filters, or perhaps ultraviolet or infrared filters. So then the question is, first of all, do you want a color image? Then is it possible? How to do that? If it's RGB, RGB, RGB in neat rows as the spacecraft pans across the subject, that's a good situation. Then you can build a color image with some work, but it's there, the data's there. But then a lot of times, because the purpose of these missions is scientific research, not color landscape photography, sometimes you'll have ultraviolet, red, and infrared. And then that's really hard to deal with. Or if it's red and no green, but red and blue and no green, you can make a synthetic green by combining the red and the green, the red and the blue, because it's in the middle, in the spectrum, And in fact, a number of the images of Saturn down below, down in the exhibition, have synthetic green layers to produce an RGB final. Okay, I don't know if I answered your question there, but it's like,
But I think
I'll stop talking now.
I think your question about perspective and distance and it's interesting because I look at the photographs of Mars, for example, or the Moon, where humans have landed, I feel that I have an orientation of, if you said this is the northern part of Mars, I'd say, oh, really? Okay, yeah. But when you get into, the distant planets, and it seems almost as if you would be disoriented anyway. And so
gas.
up
They're
and
balls of
down
gas.
and north and south don't really matter. So in a way, what you're dealing with is composing, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And defining a perspective. And in that sense, they're very different from more traditional, conventional landscape compositions. And
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think so much of landscape is about the fact that the perspective you have as a photographer pointing your lens at it is that you're standing on the ground.
Yeah, exactly.
And aerial imagery is already a bit different from that, right?
Yeah.
If you're not standing on ground, then there's a destabilizing element. But
Yeah,
floating,
is there a horizon line at all is the question.
yeah, sometimes
yeah.
there's just no horizon line, and that's very destabilizing. But I think also just the sheer knowledge that what we're looking at in this show that has some guy's name on it as the artist, right?
Yeah.
And yet the images are made
Yeah.
in a realm we cannot fathom, right? We don't know where that is. We don't know where you're standing. We don't know where the camera is. We don't know how the image was made. We can't figure any of it out. And that's very destabilizing. That's kind of interesting. And in fact, one of the things that strikes me about your pictures is very often I relate to them more through science fiction. Right?
Yeah. Okay.
That's my familiarity, is going to see, sometimes not very good Hollywood movies where most of the budget was spent on trying to evoke, that view that we're seeing in your picture, which is ostensibly documentary, on some level.
Well, I think they
It's showing
are
it, yeah, it's showing
on
this
some
thing.
level documentary. I mean, in the way that any photograph is on some level documentary.
Right,
you know.
exactly.
And in fact, a dramatic feature film is a documentation of acting and lighting. I mean,
Right.
but that is part of the point of the work, is to bring it within the realm of our experience. And part of my motivation is to continue experiencing the universe on a personal level. I was talking at dinner last night. In the table talk at dinner, I was mentioning that in part, some of my motivation is, when we're children, everything is magical, and every phenomenon, the world, the lighting, the water, no water, sand, everything is incredibly magical. And then as you get older, you get used to how things work on this planet. So part of it is that to continue experiencing, learning things, seeing what's out there, and also what's down there with the electron microscopy. And by the way, that horizon line question is salient also with electron microscopy. If you can be looking straight down at something and then you tilt the stub, these little dime-wide sample stubs, tiny little stubs, which are, when you look at them when you look at what's on the surface of them with an electron microscope, they turn into the Serengeti, for God's sake. They become vast, And the question is what to do. You can tilt them, and then suddenly you have a horizon line with objects arranged in space rather than looking straight down. And I've done both, and I've done various aspects of that, So it's definitely, it's about phenomenal reality and expanding our view of it and bringing it to us so we can read it and understand it rather than just having a notional idea of it.
And I think that has been part of the exploration of astronomical images right from the beginning.
Yes.
Because you've got that wonderful book in the vitrine in the entranceway by Naismith and Carpenter.
Yes.
Where they were unable, because of the technology available to them at the time in the 1870s, they were unable to capture very clear, distinct photographs of the surface of the moon. They printed these in Woodbury type and like very beautiful images. But so what they did was one of them was an engineer, the other was an astronomer, and they constructed from the photographs that they'd taken, which were perhaps not defined enough for them, but they made plaster models and then photographed the plaster models.
In controlled conditions.
To be able to do that. So that kind of manipulation isn't just manipulation for the sake of, it being beautiful, but it's to try to express more clearly. It might be considered to be fictional, but it's to trying to get us closer to the reality of that faraway object.
By the way, it's interesting. So John Herschel predated them in doing plaster models of the moon and photographing them, which I discovered as I researched cosmographics, so decades before. At the dawn of photography, we were already doing that.
Yes.
And Daguerre attempted, one of the first uses of photography was to photograph the moon, but because of the time exposure, because the emulsions were so slow, it was a streak on the glass. So that takes you right to the problem.
On the plate,
On a plate. That was the essence of the problem.
We don't know where that is, that Daguerre type.
Well, there was a fire in his studio.
No, that was with Arago, with Francois Arago.
Okay, well,
because Humboldt, when he
Ann
was...
Thomas here.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to be like that, but it's really interesting because it was January of 1839.
I love
so
this.
it was before the announcement of the daguerreotype.
Okay.
And that it was probably Arago who said to him, "You've got this new process, go photograph the moon." You know?
Right.
So-
But I
and-
find it fascinating that one of the very first photos was, let's see what we can do here.
I do too.
Yeah.
I think that's amazing. And it was just too faint, and the exposure was probably way too long. And so Humboldt thought, he went to visit Arago, who was sick in bed, and Arago showed him the daguerreotype, and he said, he was polite, but he said it didn't quite, meet.
Do it.
Yeah, that's right.
But that whole business of
Super
making the
interesting.
plaster model and then photographing it in controlled conditions, that's like Stanley Kubrick and
Yeah.
2001: A Space Odyssey
Yeah.
right there.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk all night just amongst ourselves, but I'd love to see if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask, Michael or Ann. One? Okay, we've got a bunch of hands going up. So once again, a reminder that once I pick you, we would love for you to wait until the microphone is in your hands, okay? So the first person that we're going to pick is you right there with your sweater. There you go.
You with the
behind
sweater.
you. Sorry. I guess everyone's wearing a sweater.
Hi. That excellent point. And thank you all so much for your time and for coming to speak to us. I do have a question kind of at the corner of tech and art, we'll say. So given the increase of objects in low Earth orbit, do you have any anticipation of the risk of the Kessler syndrome presenting an issue to space photography? If you send up a really cool satellite array with a really cool camera and all of a sudden some space debris pops it off into low Earth orbit, has that been accounted for in future photography projects?
Yeah, it's like that scene in WALL-E when they, have to shoulder their way through the screen of low Earth object junk in order to get anywhere. I am not an expert on that syndrome. I am worried. I think, the latest I have heard is that the Russians are working on a nuclear device for low Earth orbit in order to try to immobilize American spy satellites. I mean, the minute we have anything like that going on, we very well could have a serious problem with any future space missions, But I'm not an expert on that, so all I'll say is that I share your concern. I think you're concerned because you wouldn't have asked that question without being concerned.
And we have already had an example of nuclear debris coming down in, was it
Yes.
1957? From
Yeah.
a Russian orbiting satellite that went awry, and
Right, but
Up in the
this is a
northern
nuclear
Canada.
weapon, not a nuclear
yeah.
reactor.
Yeah.
I guess that
Yeah.
distinction can be lost on people.
So
There's another sweater here,
I was about to say.
bright orange.
This gentleman is next.
Hi, thank you. I was just also about technology. So as AI technologies are improving and predictive imaging is coming into photo editing, do you plan to bring that into your work, or do you stress the importance of the hand?
Predictive imaging.
So using AI technologies to basically composite your image.
Oh, so, it's very interesting. Because I'm on deadline, I probably shouldn't even be in Toronto because I have a mid-March deadline for a book. And I'm processing all of these electron microscope images. And Photoshop, as of the last less than a year, has, AI tools that are called content awareness fill. And with the electron microscope images, there's very typically stuff stuck to these little tiny samples. It's impossible to clean them all the way. So you have the sample and then things stuck to it, And it used to be that I would sit there and, by hand, clone and, I'm not a scientist. I don't need to be absolutely scrupulous to the sample. Art is the lie that tells the truth, right? So I would do that by hand. But now, I can define this thing stuck to my favorite radiolarian sample, and then if I'm lucky, with a few tries, there'll be a perfectly plausible patch. Okay, so I am doing that. When it comes to constructing, when it comes to AI tools, I'm not currently doing that type of image production with the planetary images, you know. I do have dozens and hundreds and thousands of SEM scans. To my knowledge, there is no software, there's no AI software out there yet that can help assemble that stuff. Maybe in a couple years there will be that kind of thing. But you know, what I'm doing is very specialized, right? I mean, a lot of what is being put on the market is something that millions of people will spend money on. I mean, this is very arcane, you know, this putting together mosaics through tiles. So it might be some time before there's such a tool. I would use it, but I would draw the line at, for this type of image, you know, I would draw the line at creating it from the ground up. You know, then it's not, you know, then it's an AI image, right? I'm not saying that I'm against AI images per se, but if they can't be presented as electron microscope images of a radiolarian, for example, not really. But having said that, I'm making little patches. So the question is, what percentage?
Okay, next question.
There's a gentleman there in the back with his hand up for a while now.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. Just out of curiosity, what drove you to do this? Like a lot of times when a person's like curious or like they're going on their journey, they exhibit various amount of like curiosity or some level of experience that they want to exhibit, right?
Yeah.
So what drove you?
Well, I've just been fascinated by that frontier and fascinated by the fact that we are going out there and we're seeing these things. And, you know, I mean, one story I have told is that when I was 6 years old, my mom took me to see the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it absolutely blew my mind, you know, and impacted me. And I'm very grateful to her because if you're at the right age, you know, a masterpiece can really rearrange your neurons in such a way that, in a good way. And so after that, it was clear to me, even if I couldn't articulate it, that that type of subject matter is very implicated. It's all interwoven with existential questions about our position in the universe, in space and time. And, you know, and so that's what motivates me, is to look at those things. You know, so for example, the book I showed the cover of, Cosmic Graphics, none of the images in it are by me, but it's my work because it's my research into human civilization's attempts to, not to sound too grandiose here, but that's basically what it is. You know, at least, you know, Western civilization. I didn't spend as much time on Asian images or attempts as I should have, but book deadlines, Eric Himmel, you know. You know, that was looking at the history of our efforts as a species. Then I've done my work with raw data, you know, and then with other projects, I'm also using other people's attempts to produce images and so on. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Purpose behind it?
You know, to experience these things myself, and then to do it professionally, not just in self-indulgent way, to produce a professional body of work that has a chance of communicating to a lot of people in a meaningful way. And I also write about the process and the story of the human story of trying to understand, as I said, our position in space and time. It's hard to be reductive. It's hard to really answer that correctly, I think. Yeah.
I'm interested in if to the degree there's a continuum between your work of space and photography and art and science historically. And you mentioned Daguerre, but there's one instance that struck us, and that is it was the turn of the century work of Loewy and Pousseau, a series of moon pictures, between the end of the 19th century and early the 20th century. And it happened that Anne and I were in a Paris gallery, and we came across them, and we purchased those works as art. We really didn't have any relationship to particularly the thing. They were moon pictures, but there was the aesthetic quality. So I'm rather asking Anne, are you, when does, or how do you know
me? Okay.
when a work of the many works taken of space has an artistic quality?
Well, I think that's a very good example of the Louis and Pursue, because they're very large photogravures, and they're done with the intent of having a great presence. It's not like, let's call it a discovery photograph, which is a term that John Darius, who wrote a really interesting book, published it in 1984 on what lies beyond the visible. And he cites, I believe, in that book, an image that, well, it was E.E. Barnard, and he was trying to do a star, a documentation of the Milky Way and the star clusters in the Milky Way, and discovered a comet in it. But that was a very documentary image. You know, it's not done to knock your socks off visually. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to being something that you'd put on the wall and, you know, look at it daily. So it was a kind of serviceable but very important image. The Louis and Pursue, I think, were just picking up on this beautiful, this amazing landscape that had never been really, you know, turned into art before. So that's a good example of that meeting of art and science. There's also a wonderful, I can't remember if it was John Sarkowski or Peter Galassi who used the term that photography was the bastard child of science deposited on the doorstep of art. Like, so forevermore that relationship, I think, will.
That's really an interesting quote.
Yeah.
That sounds
Yeah.
like Galassi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we don't get into bastard child syndrome these days.
You know, if I can just pick up on that intriguing question, did the gentleman leave?
He
About
did, yeah.
what motivates me. You know, in my very first book, I quote, the epigraph is by the great German language, Romanian Jewish Holocaust survivor, poet Paul Celan, who committed suicide in I think it was 1969 by jumping in the Seine. Incredible poet, very hard to translate. But the epigraph was, above the gray-black wasteland, a tree-high thought strikes the optical tone. There are still songs to sing beyond mankind. And I thought, that's really extraordinary, because part of what I'm about is, you know, I think that you know, I do it, all of us in this room do it. We spend a lot of time thinking about our concerns, the human race's concerns, our culture, Canada, the USA, stupid politics, war, all this stuff. And we get very absorbed in this, and it's, you know, a lot of what I'm doing, you know, is saying, well, let's look out beyond mankind and look at the rest, which is, there's a lot of the rest. There's really a lot. It's like most of the universe is the rest. So that's part of what motivates me too, is to look. I don't want to turn my back on the human race, and I'm using technologies, and, you know, and I'm a human after all. But it's about looking outside of that sphere that we're so exposed in and active in, you know, and to try to look at something that is less known, you know. And it's not even about being less known. It's like there are still songs to sing beyond mankind. Yeah, that's it.
We have time for 2 more questions. There's one over here.
Thank you for the talk. You mentioned that 2001 was a film that rearranged your neurons. It was for me as well. Another film that's done that for me is The Tree of Life. And I was wondering if you might talk about your involvement in that film.
Oh, that's a nice question. Thank you. I mean, I got contacted. I was on another book deadline, and I got contacted, by Terrence Malick's folks, and he liked my work and wanted to see if I would be open to collaborating. And Terrence Malick is one of those directors who I'm absolutely, a fan of, if that's the word. Very much admire. And I said, yes, let's see what we can do together. And so what did I do? I mean, that whole cosmology part of Tree of Life, I supervised some sequences there, and a bunch of work that I had either done myself or had shown up in projects of mine also was licensed for use in the film, and I got to go to London and work with Double Negative, the CGI house, to produce sequences for the cosmology parts of Tree of Life, and also to meet Terry, who's really great. So I don't know what else to say about it other than that I was very proud to be involved, and and I am a filmmaker. I mean, I used to be a filmmaker, and it was nice to go back into that world a little bit. And also with a very serious filmmaker, very serious guy, very creative. Yeah, that's it, really.
Okay. One more question? Anyone? Let's see, this gentleman down here.
There was a lady at the back.
There's a lady in the back as
Yeah.
well.
Okay, 2 more questions. This gentleman and then the lady in the back, and then we are done.
Yes, question that you partially answered when you talked about using the Photoshop content to fill in
Yeah.
to correct your microscopic structures. I was wondering with your beautiful planetary photographs, how much are there? You showed us one of the early, less processed images where there's a series of perforations in it. So I was wondering how much are you filling in or inventing with that? And then related to this question is, can scientists use your work as kind of evidence or as a kind of research model?
Okay, I'll answer the second part first. They don't need to. They have the raw data. They just don't need to. I mean, the final polished image is not relevant really to them. And then, and to answer the first part, it depends on the generation of spacecraft, I mean, what I showed with all those dots, that was from Voyager. The Voyagers didn't even have a CCD. They had a CRT. There was a cathode ray tube TV camera on those things. Still is, turned off. And those marks were because of the expansion and contraction of the tube, so they needed to be able to sort of have a grid, So there was a lot of hand cloning there, way before AI tools. So it all depends, on the source image. With latter day missions, typically you don't have that at all, and it's really a question of compensating for differing geometries due to the speed of the spacecraft, therefore the changing angle on a subject. If you want to make a mosaic of many images together, there can be a change in angle if the spacecraft is going super fast. Or if the clouds are moving on Jupiter, for example. So, I like to say that, for example, that with that big Jupiter print downstairs where there's the moon at the limb. Have you seen the show? Yeah. I arranged everything around the moment when the moon goes over the limb, and everything else had to be built out from there, because in the data set, the moon is progressing across the planet, and in order to get the full planet, and so I've used the term aggregate accuracy. I was going for a kind of aggregate accuracy. But we're conditioned to think that there should be a split-second shot. Well, okay. I mean, that's just one way of looking at phenomenal reality. I mean, there are other methodologies, which is what I get to play with. Yeah.
Okay. And then the question from the back.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. Everything's been so interesting.
Thanks.
We took a look at your exhibit downstairs earlier, and I was just wondering about your process. And it sounds like you go through hundreds of thousands of images, but how long does it actually take for you to composite one image? And do you ever work on something and then just say, actually, I didn't like it, and just start over?
Sure. It all depends on how ambitious the image is. So for example, to go back to that Jupiter image, that took a lot of work. And then it's never truly ever finished. I mean, you have to, in the end, say, okay, that's it, and you print it. So it all depends. I mean, if you're lucky, you can get this. I mean, for example, there's also a Martian sunset in there, a very small print, because it's really just a handful of shots stacked, composited to make color, and there isn't a lot of data there. I mean, it's just capture that moment and put it out there. And that actually did take a lot of work, though, because then you have to try to get the foreground, some detail in the foreground, or else it's just black and then the sunset, And there was detail there to bring out. So it all depends on the image, how much work goes into it. And yes, of course, sometimes you work on something and then, on the next day you wake up, have your cup of coffee, put it on the screen. It's like, no, put that in the back in the folder. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming out tonight.
Yeah,
and
thank you, everyone. And I really want to thank Michael. I want to thank Anne for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us tonight. Before you leave, I do want to remind you all to visit Michael's exhibition. It is going to be on view through April 5th. Tour groups can reserve times in our galleries on Tuesdays by appointment. A lot of people don't know that. The gallery is closed, but it's available if you make an appointment. Otherwise, we're open to the public on Wednesdays from 12 noon to 8 p.m. and from Thursdays through Saturdays between 12 noon and 6 p.m. Thank you again. Have a great night.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Oh.